My name is Michelle Wu, and I'm Chair of the Committee on Planning, Development, and Transportation. Today we're here for a public hearing on two dockets, so we'll take them each separately in a slightly, actually pretty varied topics. The first one will be docket 1539, message and order for the confirmation of the appointment of Jeffrey Gonyeau as an alternate member of the Boston Landmarks Commission for a term expiring June 30th, 2021. And the second will be docket number 1538, message and order authorizing the City of Boston to accept and expend the amount of $200,000 in the form of a Community Mitigation Fund Transportation Planning Grant from the Massachusetts Gaming Commission to be administered by the Boston Transportation Department. I'd like to remind everyone that this public hearing is being recorded and broadcast live. Channels Comcast 8, RCN 82, and Verizon 1964, as well as streaming on the City of Boston website. We'll take public testimony for those who might be interested, if you would sign in near the door. And I think those who are planning on testifying know the drill, but at the start of testimony, please state your name, address, and affiliation. So again, we will start with the landmarks appointment confirmation first. The City Council's role here is to, in some ways, interview and get to know the appointees and confirm the mayor's appointments to the Landmarks Commission. We have here the appointee himself, as well as Roseanne Foley from the Landmarks Commission. So if either one of you would like to, Jeffrey, would you like to introduce yourself and tell a little bit about your background and your interest in this particular role? And then if Roseanne wants to chime in or add anything after that.
Sure. My name is Jeffrey Gonyeau. I've been a Dorchester resident since 1997, so 21 years now. And I actually have worked in preservation here in Boston since, in a professional capacity since about 2001, when I began working at Historic Boston Incorporated. And I worked there at that nonprofit developer of historic buildings, many of which were formerly city-owned properties. So HBI does a great job of taking problems off the city's hands and turning them into great things in communities around the city. And after 13 years at HBI, I began consulting on my own about 5 years ago to help save and restore another landmark building in Dorchester, All Saints Church. And about 3 years ago, I began working as a circuit rider for Preservation Massachusetts, which is the statewide historic nonprofit advocacy organization. And I think my interest in becoming an alternate commissioner of the Landmarks Commission really comes out of the fact that my introduction to preservation was community-based. So, and it's actually when I got to know Roseanne was to help get a Boston landmark restored in Dorchester, the Peabody Square clock, which was a great project in that you think that something like that, an over 100-year-old street clock would seem like an obsolete piece of city furniture, but in fact people were really upset that it wasn't working. Mm-hmm. So we got it working again, and I'm amazed that even when people have watches and a cell phone telling them what time it is, they get really upset if the clock either stops or is slow or fast. So that kind of, that's what really got me hooked into historic preservation, particularly at a community-based level, and the rest is history, so they say.
Thank you. And Roseanne, could you talk a little bit about the role and what makes for an ideal commissioner?
Sure. I have to say we're delighted to have Jeffrey Gonyeau nominated for this vacancy. It's been vacant for a number of years for some reason, and having an alternate for Lynn Smilage, who is our chair, will be a great addition to the commission. What the Boston Landmarks Commission does, and we do have 9 other commissions that oversee historic districts in Boston. The Landmarks Commission has purview over the individual landmarks in Boston, which include everything from the Blake House in Dorchester to the Charles River Esplanade, Franklin Park. We have a wide range of landmarks that are in need of design review. So Jeff brings to the table a great understanding of how the landmarking process helps to improve the city and is an addition to the economic life of the city as well. So we're just pleased as punch.
Great. So in terms of the alternate role, does it come into play often? Is it if you need quorum or sort of, next opening for a commissioner? Is that tend to be a pipeline?
So if anyone wants to read the state law that guides our work, the member and alternate roles are discussed in there pretty extensively. But basically, it's a way for, if Lynn does need to take a break once in a while for some reason, Jeff can step in to help with the vote and ensure that there is a quorum. However, he can attend every commission hearing, and sometimes he may vote and sometimes not, depending on who else is present.
Got it. So Jeff, have you been present and involved with Landmark Commission meetings already?
I've attended, not in the capacity as a potential
Right.
alternate, but in my past work I've attended many hearings and have been part of the process of nominating new properties to become Boston landmarks, some successfully, which is great, and some not successfully or some pending, but yes, I have, so I'm familiar with that process.
Is there any facet of the process that you would recommend changing? Or, I mean, certainly we're bound by different types of ordinances and laws and regulations, but if you had full reign to do whatever to improve the landmarking process, what would some of your recommendations be?
Well, I think the top one would be that there's a very long list of pending landmarks that need study reports completed so that that process can be completed. So I'm not sure that many people understand outside of the nitty-gritty of this world that there's a list of whatever the number is, over 100 Boston landmarks, yet there's this backlog of many, probably as much or as many, as large as that list, that because of the lack of resources to have those study reports completed and the lack of staffing capacity to be able to push those over the line, they're sort of foundering a bit. And so that would be something that I would recommend, would be to have the city give the Landmarks Commission the resources to help with that backlog, because they've been deemed to be, those resources have been deemed to have historic significance to the city, and without that final push to get them over the line, that's a real challenge for them.
Got it. And then any other recommendations for how landmarks are considered, or anything else around the process?
I think that there's a lot of, the Landmarks Commission has shown a lot of flexibility in what they will consider to be landmarked. And I know we have the recent case of the Citgo sign, which was a complicated case, but the fact that a sign might join that list is interesting, is the fact that the Blake House, which was built in 1668 in Dorchester, Boston's oldest surviving house, is also on that list. So the fact that people are willing to consider a wide range of things to be entered into the city's list of its most highly protected historic resources, I think is very interesting and important.
Got it. Speaking of the Citgo sign, what is the latest in terms of the possibility for future landmarking? And I know that there was a veto of the Landmark Commission's decision, but does that preclude future consideration of status, or would it just need to be started from the beginning in terms of the process?
It doesn't preclude future landmarking efforts, and we want to say we're delighted that the sign will be preserved where it is for a lengthy period of time, and we don't have to worry about that, and we can move on to some of the pending landmarks that Jeff has mentioned. But yeah, in the future, sure, they could move forward toward landmarking again.
And the current agreement is for, was it for 30 years or so, or?
Correct.
Okay. Okay. In terms of the council's role in all of this, I mean, in my 5 years on the council, I think there might have been just one or two votes that that have actually come to us in terms of approving a landmark. I don't know if it's even been two. So is there any, any commentary on councilor's role or familiarity or potential for us to be more informed and educated at least about the processes that are happening on that side?
No, definitely Landmark staff would be delighted to come and present about our work, just to familiarize everyone with that. And also focus in on some of the issues such as the pending landmarks list. We actually have a hearing tomorrow night where we'll be discussing our work plan, which is a place where the commission prioritizes which pending landmarks get the next study reports and how to handle that. So we're looking at next year as being a good year to partner on being a little bit more assertive about how we do our landmarking.
And I think from a councilor's kind of day-to-day work, most of the petitions are generated, it's only 10 people need to sign a petition and submit them. And if councilors could pay attention to what's going on in their districts to understand what historic resources might be located there that are endangered in some way or could benefit from the protection of landmark status, then they should just keep their ears open, because it often comes from the citizens and constituents. So.
Great, thank you. I want to recognize that my colleague Lydia Edwards has joined us. And speaking of the next year and being more assertive, I know Councilor Edwards had filed a hearing order specifically about historic preservation that is still in the docket. So Councilor Edwards, do you have any question for Jeffrey Gonyeau?
No, and I really appreciate your comments coming in, specifically about community-driven initiatives. I know in the North End we're looking at a community-driven initiative. I think the signatures or the petition may have been submitted recently, specifically talking about the Nazaro Center and looking at how we can do that. What would be really great is when we're talking about community-driven initiatives that either there's a workbook or work understanding so that people aren't just randomly, as developers have said to me, trying to preserve something last minute to stop development versus truly preserving the character of the neighborhood, which I fully support, making sure our historic preservation is at the forefront of all community members. So we don't want it to be seen as a sword against anything, just more of a shield to protect the character of our neighborhood. So I'd love to continue to have the conversation about that.
I think that's a struggle with preservation all the time, is how we can be more proactive instead of reactive, and I think that you hit the nail on the head with that.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. Right, thank you. So that's all the questions that we have on this side, and we'll open it up to public testimony to comment on the appointment or the nomination. So we'll start with Greg Galer.
I'm Greg Galer, the Executive Director of the Boston Preservation Alliance. We're obviously in dialogue and testifying in front of the Landmarks Commission on a very regular basis, intimately involved with many of the issues that came up earlier, and we support many of the comments made. I just want to say briefly, Jeff has been a colleague and a great community member and alignment and informant in terms of what's going on in the Dorchester and other neighborhoods since I arrived at the Alliance about 6 years ago. I think he brings a really wonderful perspective from the local Dorchester neighborhood activism through statewide work, and he's been both a practitioner in terms of involved with specific projects. He mentions his work with All Saints Church and really knowing the nitty-gritty of how a preservation project works, all the way through policy issues as he works with Preservation Mass. And I think that's a really helpful perspective to add to the Landmarks Commission. So the Preservation Alliance is very supportive of his nomination and look forward to working with him. Thank you.
Thank you, Greg. That's all in terms of public testimony that we had signed up, unless anyone else feels moved to join. Then with that, we'll conclude the first half of the hearing. Thank you so much, Jeffrey, and thank you so much, Roseanne.
Thank you.
Feel free to stay if you would like, or I know you're very, very busy. So we'll then shift to the second docket. So let me just read that docket into the record once more. Docket 1538, message and order authorizing the City of Boston to accept and expend the amount of $200,000 in the form of a Community Mitigation Fund Transportation Planning Grant from the Massachusetts Gaming Commission to be administered by the Boston Transportation Department. The grant will fund engineering and design services for the reconstruction of Sullivan Square, Rutherford Avenue in Charlestown. And we have with us Jim Gallo. Jim, would you feel free to make any statement or tell us about this particular grant?
Sure. Thank you, councilors. I'm happy to report that this would be the second time we've received money from the Gaming Commission. The Gaming Commission has a very keen interest in seeing a project that we're working on, the Rutherford Sullivan Square project, advance, and so they've been very open to our two applications, one last year for $250,000 and the new one this year for $200,000 to help support the costs that the city would be incurring to do the design of the Rutherford Sullivan Square project. The Rutherford Sullivan Square project is moving along swiftly, and we have a $153 million in funding from both federal and state sources, which will allow us to advertise the project in federal fiscal year 2020. And the construction would start in 2021 and last for about 4 years. And this project is going to help support all of the economic development while being a major advance in terms of public safety, in terms of pedestrian access to the T-stations, bicycle facilities that are going to run up both sides of the corridor and actually connect into the regional network of bicycling, and an enhancement to public open space. And also it will create some very advantageous opportunities in the way of transit-oriented development, especially in the Sullivan Square area, also supporting the development along the corridor itself, the length of Rutherford. We'll be seeing some expansion to the size of Ryan Playground as part of this, and we'll be doing some good work in terms of resiliency. It's an interesting sub-note to this, but it's a very important piece of the project, that a piece of Main Street where you pass the fire station and you're next to the rail that comes out of the Massport property, we'll be raising that 3 feet at its lowest point. And that's going to buy us about 30 years of protection for flooding that otherwise would come off of those properties. So we've been looking very closely on resiliency in the way we're designing this project, and that's a keynote that will save a lot of aggravation from flooding off of the Mystic River. The other good note to bring to your attention is that in addition to having other sources of funds, federal and state dollars for construction, we've also managed to get the earmarks that are left over from a bygone era, which no longer in Washington, D.C., transportation earmarks, but there are some that were left over, and we're able to use the federal earmarks that remain for this project for 80% of the cost of design. So the good news here, in summary, is that with these grants, we're not only covering the first 80% of our design costs, but we're also taking a big bite out of the remaining 20% that is upon the city to pay. Typically, on a project that goes through the state system, where we're using the federal dollars, there's an obligation for the municipalities to pay 100% of the design costs. So we've managed to save the city a substantial amount of money, and we'll probably wind up paying something approximately 10 to 15% of the design cost, as opposed to 100% by the combination of the federal earmarks and these gaming grants. With that, I'd be open to questions.
Thank you, Jim. Councilor Edwards?
Thank you, and thank you, Jim, for all your work, making yourself readily available, answering questions and things like that. So just walk me through the 2 different tracks. I know that we get federal funds when they're given here for Sullivan Square. Is that specifically Rutherford Ave? And then we're also getting funds from the casino as well. Both are, go ahead.
Oh, sure. So excuse me, we're speaking now to the design costs.
So
As
both
I
are
can
going
t-
to the same pot to design Sullivan Square and
Right.
Rutherford Avenue?
Right.
Both?
So I'm going to leave off to the side the $153 million in construction costs
Yep, that's
to
not,
build it.
we're not talking about
Yeah,
that yet.
Just
Yeah.
the design at this moment is 80%. We have enough federal earmarks, and the federal earmarks can cover 80% of design. If you, the key to getting that earmark to cover design is that you also need to be able to point to the fact that the construction costs are covered.
Right.
So when we accomplished that, it freed us up to use some of the remaining federal earmark money to cover 80% of the design. So the federal government still would require 20% match.
Okay.
And that match is on the city as opposed to 100% of the design costs. We're down now to just 20% of the design costs. And as we secured $250,000 from the Gaming Commission last year, that was able to offset the city's otherwise portion of the design costs, that 20%.
So the 20%, when you said it's 10 to 15% now, it's because of the offsets from the?
Correct.
From the casino, okay.
Correct.
So, right now, traffic is a major issue on the Sullivan Square, the corridor, and I get a lot of calls about that. And one of the things we're wondering, since this grant is going to BTD, is there any way to leverage some of this funds to help with, the crosswalks has been one of the biggest issues, that people aren't seeing them, they would like them to have them redone or painted over. I don't know if police detail, is there any way that because mitigation is about, the growing pains of the moment, as well as ultimately the reward for, working with whatever, the casino and working with the federal government, more the casino. How are we leveraging, or are we at all leveraging to get more resources right now for the folks who are stuck in traffic every single day?
I'd say a couple things about that. First, I have to give you the disappointing news that as this is a planning grant, it can't be used for those types of things. So this particular money can't go to police details or crosswalks at this point. It's specifically for planning, which will cover design of a project of this nature. But what's happening right now, it's important to remember the wind mitigation is taking place right now. And some of the things that that's doing, including we asked them several months back to refresh the crosswalks, and they did that as they had the construction work taking place around Sullivan Square. A major advance in traffic management is going to take place through the work that they're doing. Because today, where the ramp to Route 1 exists off of Rutherford, a lot further south from Sullivan Square.
Right.
That's the furthest we have now to connect any traffic signals in this, out in the field to this building, to our traffic management center on the 7th floor. We prevailed upon WIN, and they graciously accepted our ask to put conduit and connect fiber cables and copper cables from that point at the ramp to Route 1 and to continue it up through Sullivan Square and then over to Cambridge Street where the on-ramp, off-ramp is, and also to the other side, they're going to continue that cable.
34 minutes,
Sorry.
29 seconds distant.
They're going to continue that conduit and cable literally right to and across the Alfred Street Bridge and over to the other side of the Mystic, where we're going to connect to about 4 more intersections.
That's in Everett?
Some of them are in Everett, a couple of them are in Boston. And that's a deliberate effort by BTD to ignore property, municipal lines, because we do it with Brookline. We do it to make sure that we connect a logical corridor together. We talked to Everett, asked them if they'd be open to that, and they said that would be great. So part of it is to do the maintenance of traffic on a corridor like that that's going to be critical to get traffic moving along that corridor smoothly and down Rutherford smoothly. So we'll have...
coordinating the lights
Yes.
That's what it is. It's light coordination across municipalities.
Yeah, and-
From the 7th floor, so you'll be able to control the lights in Everett,
Yeah, just a couple of them, just to get the bunch of traffic that could
3 blocks after the bridge.
Yeah, just to make sure that we're keeping things smooth in Boston by making it smooth a little bit past the border. We have a number of signals that are connected to our traffic center that are owned by other jurisdictions. For instance, Mass DOT signals, DCR signals, Massport signals. So when we get into a situation where we're trying to manage traffic best for the residents and people who are passing through Boston, we want to make sure that we think, oh, if there's 1 or 2 across the border, we're open to connecting them too, to make it work well. Or if they're in the care and custody and ownership of a state agency, it doesn't matter to us because it doesn't matter to the public that they're going through a corridor. And we'd hate to have somebody travel down a corridor and say, oh, well, we're
It's
not
not
going to
worth it.
fix that problem because it's owned by DCR or Mass
Right,
DOT.
Right. So, and this, you expect this kind of coordination to be completed when?
In June?
In June of next year. And then how is this coordination working with, the Alfred Street Bridge, they're working on that,
Yep.
and also with the North Washington Street Bridge, working on that?
Yeah,
How's that
yeah.
coordination going?
Yeah, so if a
So,
few.
we're getting mitigation, which is great for one of the major veins into Boston.
Yes.
Talking about communication with the state and
Yep.
whatnot, give us a quick update.
Yeah, how are we kind of
It has to be,
looking
right?
at a situation where there's a lot of moving parts, and what are we
Massive.
doing to keep tabs on it all and to make adjustments? First thing, as far as the North Washington Street Bridge, when that was being negotiated in terms of what the contract would say, we asked MassDOT, and they agreed to keep, there's probably about 20 signals, 20 traffic cameras that are going to be managed and kept functioning and feedback to our traffic center, so we can see that by the contractor to make sure that those are running in both the areas on both sides of the bridge, but also over by the Science Museum, throughout the area where the traffic impacts are going to spread.
Okay.
So we've got a bunch of cameras that will help us keep tabs on what's going on. There's an obligation in that contract that the communications, which are going to be critical, that go over that bridge, are maintained all through the construction so that we don't lose the ability to use the tools we're building now up in Sullivan Square area and other parts of Charlestown where we have connections already,
Right.
plus the new ones we're going to have. There's an obligation for a constant, relook at how the traffic signals are set to operate, and not just at both ends of the bridge, but several other intersections in the area, so that we know that there's a likelihood that a lot of people will use an alternative route, for instance, over the Gilmore Bridge and down through Leverett Circle. And that's a way to, the people are going to be encouraged through signage to think about that use. They're not going to be required to use it, but we're going to keep a close eye on the corridors like that people might choose as an alternative. Going up to the Alfred Street Bridge, that work will be done at the end of May. So that will be behind us, and that's a good thing. That'll be
Yeah.
back to its full capacity.
Okay, because it's just, what I think a lot of people are concerned about is, as we improve in one, are we really just pushing the headaches onto further down the line?
Right.
And so to have a constant understanding of how the improvements are also going down the line too, and being coordinated is
Right.
vital for our quality of life at this point.
Right, and that's one of the reasons why we have, I think some of the people at MassDOT think of my middle name as video camera, traffic camera. Because every time we have a conversation about any of these projects, one of the first things I want to do is make sure that we've got visibility. We can see what's going on in the areas that are going to be impacted. And they've been very good. MassDOT's been very good in helping us build our, we've got probably 550 cameras we can look at now. So it really helps to be able to, see problems that might be brewing.
Right.
We've had to call over on a couple of the projects we mentioned and make sure that they know, hey, wait a minute, you gave us a plan to set up the traffic in a certain way. You didn't do it. We see it right here from City Hall. So we also have that type of a role of keeping a close eye and making sure that, number one, the plan for the traffic management is set up in a way that we feel is the best that can be done under the circumstances of all that construction taking place. But secondly, we're always looking for better. We have some talented people up in BTD's Traffic Management Center, and they come up with ideas too and let us know what we might be pushing for.
So just two last points. One, could you address when you brought up public safety, emergency vehicles and getting stuck in traffic, and how we're, that's the biggest concern I think most people have is, if they go to get somebody and they need to get them to MGH, they need to get them out of Charlestown. That's what I represent. I'm sure other areas would be equally as concerned, but MGH is a regional hospital. But for me, I'm looking at Charlestown and getting them out of there, whether they're coming down Chelsea Street, if they're coming from the Bunker Hill Street, and they're hitting this vein of traffic on Rutherford Ave. That's a huge, huge issue. And, I've gotten an email about someone who was stuck in traffic in the ambulance. So that's one thing I'd love for you to address, and how BTD is working on that. And the other one is, you brought up resiliency, and I do appreciate that analysis, but I can already hear and see the emails coming in about resiliency and the underpass, and looking at preparing for a future here in Boston. So they're kind of big, I understand, but you brought up safety and resiliency, so I wanted you to touch on that.
Oh, absolutely. So first off, that we always get the public safety agencies involved in the planning to make sure that if they're, spotting something that we're not spotting. So the plans are developed for the traffic management with their solid input. We've had probably a half a dozen meetings in the last 6 months where public safety agencies, EMS, fire, police have been at the table as we got closer to unleashing the work on the North Washington Street Bridge. And they have we keep an eye on the traffic with an eye towards, we don't want that happening. We don't want folks getting stuck. But the other player that's got the key role is the police for the detail management, and to make sure that they can keep intersections in a busy area from getting gridlocked. And I think if we keep the gridlock, the emergency vehicles can get around the other traffic on the runs, and as long as they can get through the intersections. And so it's a combination of good planning, the police being in position, and all the good input we get from the public safety agencies.
So the public safety agencies have looked at this plan, have okayed the plan and the process?
Yes.
Okay.
Yep. But we always know that, the best laid plans are going to need to be tweaked, and so we'll constantly be, in conversation with those agencies as much as they have any issues. Now, recently, the Casey Overpass project, we had, and something similar is probably going to happen on, something like the North Washington Bridge. But as things got really heavily under construction, we had the local captain or his representative on a weekly conference call. And so we'd kind of adjust how frequently we would need to talk if there was any sense of trouble. And so we do that with the state police, the MBTA police, for instance, on that one. That was a group of participants on that because of the MBTA station involved. And so we would have regular conference calls. In fact, I think I'm due for one in the middle of this week as things are wrapping up over there. So we use that strategy too, to just stay in touch, to make sure that nothing's being lost because we're making assumptions that it seems like all's quiet, but maybe it isn't. So we want to hear from people. And it's funny how you start with a big long list, DCR, MassDOT, ONS, all the city agencies, and then you can just feel it that people stop calling in. And you go, things are going all right, it's good. When they're all calling in, we've got more work to do. As far as the resiliency and the issue of the underpass, for instance, I think that keeping flooding out of the area from the Mystic River is the key for resiliency, and we're making that measure by doing the raising of Main Street. The other thing that, as we watch our threats from climate change, is that you've got the heavy storms. Now, the good news is, unlike the current underpass, which has its drainage issues, and it's something that occurred over years and years, where I'm not an expert on the area, but something that is old as that one has problems maybe with broken pipes and the drainage isn't working quite right. But this would be all brand new drainage in that, so that to the extent of a heavy rainstorm that produces a lot of water, it will be handled by the equipment that'll be in this. I would say, as a for instance, we wouldn't want to bring the I-93 back up to the surface because we're afraid it might flood someday. We want to make sure it doesn't flood. We want to make sure that that tunnel, because that's so important. You've got the Greenway and all of the development that's happened in Boston around taking and transforming that part of the city, which came with an underpass or a tunnel. We just have to make sure that it's designed properly so that it can keep up with any kind of heavy rainstorms.
Well, I think also part of that conversation or agency I'd like to see be part of this is the Boston Water Sewage Commission.
Sure.
As you may be aware, we had flooding in Charlestown down Lower Baldwin, and it backed up the raw sewage into people's homes. And so that was a coordination or a combination of the massive, what it was, a bomb cyclone, we called it. That issue, I'm also concerned with, if we have a lot of snow and then it suddenly melts. But, and that's pretty far from the Mystic. This is a different kind of flooding.
Sure.
This area is fill, right? There's a river under it. So I guess the Mystic is flowing somewhat deeper under. So as we're building these tunnels, or I don't know if we're going deeper, what we're doing, but there is a body of water moving there.
Sure.
And so the coordination with Boston Water and Sewage
Oh, that's huge.
is yes, and I would like to see, you listed several agencies, that there's communication with them as well.
Absolutely. I should not have left them out of the list. The water and sewer is a fundamental party. We just met with them and Eversource, for instance, just the other day. Because as we do things for instance, we take the city's current parking lots over there, there's going to be, the new street grid is going to go across a portion of our parking lots. Things are going to shift, and it's going to recreate the shape of the remainder parcels so they're more beneficial for development. As we do that, we have to have Eversource put their utilities under not where the streets are today, because Eversource happens to be simultaneously putting in a new transmission line up to Woburn, from Mystic to Woburn, and it's going to go right through Sullivan Square. And that's going to be needing to be not under where the street is today, because for future maintenance purposes, we want it under the street of the future. So it's going to be shifted to where the street will be. As that conversation takes place with Eversource, water and sewer is right at the table.
Okay.
We need water and sewer to be able to do all of their drainage, and a lot of new drainage is going to be created under all of the streets from Rutherford up through Sullivan Square. All of their systems are looked at and made to fit with the new street system and modernized to the extent that that's needed too.
Okay. And none of this, or do any of these conversations require work or coordination with National Grid? With the lockout, I would
I
assume
don't think
it was
we have
gonna-
any
but I don't
National
know.
Grid resources through there.
Okay.
Eversource is.
Just making sure.
Yeah, no, I haven't. I'll double check that. I'll just make
Naturally,
sure. I'll
we would
let
be
you.
concerned if there's, because we're still dealing with the lockout and those issues.
Yeah.
And trying to make sure that, well, I have constituents who can't get basic things done right now because
Yeah.
of what's going on
Yeah,
there.
I'll double check that and let you know if they're involved.
Thank
The good
you.
news would be, knock on wood, the right thing will happen in the next few months and way before the project gets advertised for construction.
Okay. Thank you.
Thank you, Counselor. So Jim, just to back up one step, what percent completion to design are we?
We're at 25%.
So
but
this
there's a lot of
200,000
work-
is still,
Excuse me?
sorry, this 200,000 is still to get to 25% design?
There's a lot of work that's already happening towards 75%, right? But the official status is 25%,
Okay,
right? So, but it'll be used in the course of the next year. And it'll help us get completed at 25, if there are any adjustments we have to make based on feedback from Mass DOT, or advance us towards 75.
Okay.
And I'm assuming that we'll be back here next year talking again about another grant of this nature, because it's really, the Gaming Commission sees it as truly what they're trying to accomplish, which is to try to help people plan and design things that are going to help the area.
what are the other types of transportation-related grants or initiatives that the city might seek funding from this particular fund for?
From this particular fund, I would say that since we're capped, the first year we got 250 because there was a set aside for the surrounding communities, and then there was another, that was, I believe, the 150,000, and another 100,000 that we competed for. So even though it looks like we're going backwards from 250 to 200, we're actually going upwards from 100 to 200 this year, because the set-aside was from earlier on, where the Gaming Commission said, these communities, when things settle, we're going to hold this money for them. It was earlier money, but it was given out in 2017.
Okay,
So hopefully it'll go up even higher, and we can start exploring other things but to the extent that it's for planning grants, it's, we'll get to a point when the planning's all done for this. So I think that might still be a couple of years off. So we'd probably be inclined towards seeing future grants for this same purpose
planning. Okay.
until we get a little further with the design cycle.
got it. And then just to touch on the resiliency piece a little bit more, so what level of sort of resiliency are we planning? What are some of the metrics that you're planning for? You mentioned the timeframe of 30 years. How many inches of water off the river, or what level of sort of 100-year store? What are we what does that get us?
That's not my expertise, so I'll have to get you an answer for that. The Environment Department headed up the effort, and I was part of the resiliency work because of the involvement I have in this project. But they're the experts in terms of those kind of metrics, and so let me get that answer for you.
So just in terms of who was at the table, was it just city people, internal city staff from the Environment Department, or were there external consultants?
Oh, external consultants. There was a report that came out for, they did two areas. They did Charlestown and East
Okay,
Boston.
got it.
And it's from that study.
Got it.
They pointed us in the right direction.
Okay. And then just in terms of what are we thinking in terms of water transportation, ferry service? It's just anytime I'm in Charlestown, all anyone
Right.
wants to talk about is traffic, transportation, and the real anxiety that it's just going to get worse with all the construction nearby and the casino.
Right. I'm going to have to consult the folks who are working more directly on that. I know that there are efforts being made. I know that, the casino, not the casino, I'm sorry, the convention center is heading up an effort to get a new water shuttle going, but I just don't have the details at my fingertips.
Okay. Is there anything else that we should know about this?
I think it's actually an amazingly good position we've gotten ourselves to, because there are very few projects of this scale that aren't somebody rebuilding a portion of the interstate highway system or something. So this is a really large project that, along with the Melnia Cass project, which is sizable as well, are two great the tables are now set to do two wonderful projects in the city. And I think we just have to keep our focus on it and get those going and start to think about what's the next generation after we get these two advertised.
So, sorry, so speaking of that, you had mentioned development parcels. Who would have ownership of those development parcels? Would that be city land or MassDOT?
There's a combination. Mostly, there's some city parcels, there's some MBTA parcels. I think between the two is most of it.
And is it city or is it BPDA when you say city?
Well, how it will ultimately, go out to development, there's a whole process now of trying to redraw the lines and transfer a parcel, so I'm not sure how it'll settle, but I'm sure Boston Planning and Development will have a huge role in terms of formulating the development ideas for the area, working with the community. They've already started thinking of it, and as we've been doing the design of the roadways and whatnot, we're not doing that just, thinking traffic only or pedestrian crossings only or bicycle tracks only. We had the Planning and Development Agency, and we also had some outside consulting help that were brought in as part of the team for designing this to say, is that a realistic size and shape to that parcel? Could it really be developed into something meaningful? And so we did look at our work, earlier work of where the traffic and, the streets and sidewalks and bike lanes would be and what we left over. And we did make some adjustments to make sure that they were viable and positively sized and shaped so that they could be successful as development parcels.
Okay. Thank you very much. Any final words, Councilor Rivers? All right, thank you, Jim. We really appreciate your time.
Oh, thank
and
you.
we'll take this up at the next council meeting.
Thank you, councilors.
This will conclude our hearing on both dockets, docket number 1538 and docket number 1539. This hearing is adjourned.